Hello, and welcome to Outspoken, our regular series of talks with LGBTQ people and those who minister with them. I'm Ryan Di Corpo, the managing editor of Outreach. I am joined by Outreach editor Father James Martin and our guest for today, the Reverend Brandan Robertson. He is a Protestant pastor, a PhD student in biblical studies at Drew University, an LGBTQ activist, and the author of several books, including Dry Bones and Holy Wars, a call for social and spiritual renewal. Dubbed the TikTok preacher by Rolling Stone for his use of social media to reach the younger generation, Robertson's writings have appeared in Outreach, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Politico, and Time Magazine, and we are very happy to have him here today. Welcome, Brandan.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be with you both.
Thank you. In an article for Outreach last November, you described having quote unquote mixed reactions to the Synod on synodality. As a Protestant pastor, I'm wondering how this very Catholic undertaking struck you. And what
Yeah,
did you make of the lack of explicit reference to LGBTQ people in the final English language report?
totally. Yeah, it's a great question. It's been remarkable to watch how, over the past few years in particular, the actions of Pope Francis have become something that all Christians are focused on, even folks in the Protestant and evangelical worlds that I come from. And so um, it felt like a lot of folks were watching the Synod and interested to see what direction um, the group ended up coming out with on all of these controversial quote unquote topics. I thought, on one hand, I mean, the report did inch towards being able to create a more inclusive church for LGBT people. And I think any progress, incremental progress, is a win. And I think Pope Francis's general message of welcome and inclusion to those who the institution might not readily open their doors to is something that has an impact on churches that I pastor in, even as a Protestant. So, on one hand, I wasn't super surprised that there was no explicit reference to LGBT people in the report, but I was grateful to see that at least beneath the surface, clearly the conversation was there, and there is ongoing thinking taking place within the Roman Catholic Church about how to include and welcome all people. And so, yeah, I was grateful for what we got and always looking for more and more. And I think that's where a lot of us are at. So
Father Jim,
Brandon,
did you want to follow up? Yes.
yeah, I'm going to shift a little bit. We could talk about the Synod, but I'm really curious about two areas that I find fascinating in your work. You're a pastor, you're a writer, you're an activist, you're a scholar. And I'm always curious, and I think I've asked you this before in person. What do you see as the difference between the kind of pastoring that is done in a Catholic context towards LGBTQ people and in a Protestant context? That's the first question. The second question is, what do you see as the differences between context for like people in my generation and people younger, like in your generation? I mean, can you talk about those two sort of uh, kind of contrasts, if you will, in your own life?
yeah, totally. I mean, it's been such an honor over the past few years to kind of get brought more into Catholic context and get to witness things up close and personally. And I think one thing, I mean, I've been really surprised at the similarities between Catholic and Protestant contexts, especially ministering to LGBT people. Here in New York City, there are so many incredible Catholic parishes that have active ministries to LGBT people that, frankly, are far more active than most of the Protestant progressive LGBT inclusive churches. And so that's been really refreshing. Even as I'm out and about in the non-religious world here in New York, I meet so many young LGBT people that say, oh, yeah, I go to X, Y, and Z churches, LGBT group. And so it's really amazing to see that. That progress is being made in the Catholic Church and queer folks are feeling welcomed. I think the clear difference is, though, that at least in the denominations I'm a part of, there's no hierarchical authority structure really. And in particular, the denomination I'm a part of, the United Church of Christ, our theology is very open. There are no official creeds or statements that all clergy or all people have to ascribe to. And that also means that our ethical perspectives are just as diverse. And so I think there's a lot more room on the Protestant side for a wide diversity of beliefs and practices and ways to minister to people, from having an openly gay pastor to every other version of LGBT inclusion in ministry. And yeah, I think that's just the nature of Protestantism, for better or for worse, that there's a lot more openness and diversity on belief and practice there. When it comes to generational divide, so to speak, I think the biggest difference is older generations simply want to be included and feel safe in the church. Um, it's not that younger folks don't want that, but mere inclusion is no longer enough for a lot of younger generations. Hearing a word of "you're welcome to be in our space" is something that folks who lived through worse periods of our national history where there weren't rights and equal status for queer folks, being welcomed and feeling like they can belong in their home church is very important. But for younger queer people, they want to see full inclusion, which I think means the ability to be themselves if they feel called to ministry, to be themselves in ministry, and to fully participate in every aspect. And I think that's the tension you're seeing in the Catholic Church, and we're seeing in many Protestant denominations as well, of this next generation saying, yes, we're grateful, thanks for the welcome, and it's got to go further. And we want to be fully included into the church, and we want to see ourselves represented in the leadership of the church. And I know that takes a long, winding road to getting to a place where that's even a possibility. But I do think that's the big shift generationally.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from younger people, that welcome is not enough, as someone said to me once. Before I throw it back to Ryan, the big question I want to ask you, and I think that our listeners would be really interested in, I know you mainly. I first knew you from your book, The Gospel of Inclusion, which is so well done. And you spoke at our last outreach conference about the Bible, and you've written about that for us. I'd love to hear, what is your response? We talk about meeting people on the stairs of the church when an LGBTQ person or a family member or anybody says, "Doesn't the Bible condemn homosexuality?" How do you? I know you've written a whole book on that, but how do you answer that kind of quickly for people?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is that America is not a very biblically literate society anymore. I think there's this idea that at one time we were, and perhaps that was true, but I think there's a lot of information about the Bible out there, and I see it all the time on social media, not just about LGBT issues, but virtually all possible topics that people think the Bible says something or have heard that the Bible says something, but have never actually done the work to actually pick up a Bible and read it. But even that's not enough. And I often say, hopefully you'll like this as Catholic siblings, but I think one of the worst things the Protestant Reformation did was, best and worst, I'll say, is it gave the Bible to everybody, which is wonderful. And it gave the Bible to a lot of folks that don't have the complex training to understand the culture, the context, the language from which the Bible emerges. And the Bible's not just a book that anybody can pick up and readily understand. It's a book that comes from a different world with different perspectives and different cultural mores. And so that's generally, if somebody says, I think the Bible condemns homosexuality, I would say, well, it sounds like you haven't actually done a lot of work to dig into the verses that condemn homosexuality, because one, the concept of sexual orientation didn't exist in the ancient world. So it's impossible for the word homosexuality to actually be a translation of any Greek or Hebrew word. And second of all, when you simply look at the sexual practices of the Greco-Roman world of the first century, for instance, they're vastly different. It was permitted for any Roman man to sexually engage with anybody of a lower status than themselves. And often that would be exploitative relationships between a man and his slave, or a man and somebody from a conquered nation. And my best research on this over the past decade has led me to believe that what Paul is talking about in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians, and even what Leviticus is talking about, are all referring to common pagan practices that revolve around sexual exploitation and abuse between men, usually. And that is nothing like modern loving same-sex relationships. So on that, I'd say the Bible doesn't say anything about LGBT relationships as we know them today, but it does rightly condemn sexual abuse and exploitation, which is something that all of us should be willing to condemn.
That's a great answer. I think we should use that as a 2-minute clip on our site from now until the end of time. Ryan, back to you.
Brandan, your ministry is what we might call extremely online, meaning you use social media and tools like TikTok to reach younger people. But as a result, you've also faced online backlash from those opposed to your mission and your work. And I know you've written a bit about this, and certainly Father Jim has had to deal with this as well. How do you deal with hateful comments from people claiming to speak for God or for the church?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question. I would love to say, and I usually have said in the past, oh, I've gotten used to it. I've been doing it for so long. But the more I've sat with it, I mean, the more uncomfortable it is that the world is in a state, but the church is in a state right now where we are so divided. And the internet has given us an air of anonymity that people feel like they have a duty and a right to be able to step up and say the most horrendous things that they're feeling or thinking at any moment about anybody that they don't understand. Um, I think what I've tried to do is cultivate a practice of empathy, though, because I have lived my entire life online. And there was a time from the age of 12 to 20 where I was that more conservative, traditional Christian on the internet, commenting on people, telling LGBT people they were going to hell, all of that stuff. And so when I see, especially on like TikTok, a lot of younger folks are reacting that way in very uncharitable ways on the internet, I remember what it was like. And I remember how much fear I had as a young person, not just because eventually I would have to wrestle with my own sexuality and faith, but just because so many people inherit a faith that is rooted in fear, that is rooted in if this one truth and one way of seeing things is challenged, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. So we need to protect this at all costs and demonize and heresy hunt and call out all those who are perverting my understanding of the truth. And it reminds me that this is a bigger problem than about sexuality in the Bible. This is a problem with how people understand God and their relationship to God. And the thing that frees me in those moments and has freed me from fear is the writing of First John that says, God is love and perfect love casts out all fear because fear has to do with judgment. If I'm feeling afraid of what I'm hearing somebody say, I need to remind myself that God is not in the fear, that love is where we should be moving from. And I try to extend that to those who are acting out of fear in the way that they comment on the internet and the way they show up in the world. But admittedly, I also fall into the reactionary tweet every once in a while or getting into the debate. And the last thing I'll say is when that happens, there's grace, of course, but debates, especially on online debates, do not change people's hearts and minds. And so if you're a person out in the world who's doing any sort of online ministry, I think my advice is don't take the bait as much as you can, because what's actually going to transform people is seeing you maintain a Christ-like presence on the internet, not your ability to have a pithy tweet or a good comeback on TikTok, because that only furthers people in their demonization and fear. And so it's generally unhelpful.
You mentioned that your views 20 years ago were, let's say, less progressive than they are now. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about that personal journey to where you are now spiritually, because I get the sense that while unique to you, it probably mirrors the experience of a lot of LGBTQ people that grew up with religion.
Totally. I mean, I think the biggest thing that ignited my transformation was the fear I received from my church. I tell my story often, but like the condensed version is in Bible college. I was at a conservative evangelical Bible school studying to become a pastor. And I had a podcast like this where I would interview folks that were a little bit outside of our theological spectrum. And I immediately started getting called into the dean's office at the school and being told that I was responsible for spreading heresy, danger to our campus by bringing people in that didn't align with the way we saw the world. And that severe response, I mean, they threatened me with expulsion 6 times over 4 years, not because I was doing any grave immoral thing, but because I was having conversations with people who had different perspectives. I recognized right away that that fear was not from God. Like, if we are pursuing truth, we shouldn't be afraid. If the truth is true, there's nothing that I can bring onto our campus or a perspective that we can bring onto a podcast that's going to harm the truth in any way. The truth should be able to stand. And it was that times, dozens of times, whether in school or in churches or on the internet, that I continually saw conservative Christian leaders responding to me and to other people with fear and demonization that brought me to the conclusion that this kind of Christianity is not what I see in the Gospels. It's not what's reflected by Jesus. And the more I began to look on the horizon for people that looked and sounded like Jesus, frankly, the more I was pulled towards a more progressive, inclusive version of Christian faith. Um, and underneath all of that, of course, was I've spent over a decade studying the Bible in academic settings. And the more you learn, when you actually dig into studying scripture and theology, the more you realize, one, things are not as certain and as clear as they once seemed. Things are a lot more ambiguous in the Bible than I think often our churches proclaim. And there's a lot of room in Christian history for diversity and disagreement and holding together as one body of Christ with a multiplicity of views. As my professors today say, there's never been Christianity. There's always been Christianities. There's always a multiplicity of ways of being Christian. And that to me is more interesting and more beautiful than trying to get everybody conformed to one exact version of how to practice and believe and live out ethics. I think there's a lot more room for the spirit to move when we embrace a diversity of views. And that has allowed me to evolve and transform my own perspective in ministry.
Let me ask one final question before I throw it back to Ryan for a conclusion. You were talking about Christianities, that's a pretty brilliant way of looking at it. And certainly you would be familiar with this as an evangelical. There's a lot of talk in the Catholic Church these days, particularly after the Synod, of very different ways of looking at Christianity in particularly Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Latin America. And, one of the critiques is that a lot of, according to reports, evangelical money goes to Africa to convince them that it is an ideology, it's colonialism. I'm sure you've heard all these. From your reading of this situation, what do you think is the most effective way of responding to some of those beliefs and some of those critiques from different cultures? What would you say, in your understanding of it, is the most helpful?
Yeah, this is a very complex question. And I think the first answer is Christians, all of us of all stripes, need to admit that we have been colonizers and that the way we've shared the gospel has not been evangelization. It has been colonization throughout much of history, forcing people to believe in things that they might not otherwise believe in, often in order to survive. And so I think there's a reckoning taking place in Christianity broadly right now, particularly Western Christianity, to acknowledge that we have, in fact, forced so many people and cultures to conform to what's not even the gospel. It's a version of European culture, frankly. But when it comes to talk about like LGBT inclusion or broader human rights in Christianity and the way that that's going out into the world, I think one, we do have to be careful that we're not going into other cultures and telling them that they need to immediately adopt our perspective, because that is the colonial impulse. But I also think the flip side of that is the conservative evangelicals, for instance, that are trying to demonize those who are advocating for an inclusive version of faith. They are the most culpable. They are in the infusion of money into these cultures and churches and denominations, perpetuating a version of colonization that should be very clear to anybody that's looking at it isn't the way of Christ. If you have to lure people with money and influence and privilege in order to align with your perspective, you're not actually convincing anybody, first of all. And second of all, you're not spreading good news in the way Jesus told us to do it. The good news should be able to stand on its own. The truth should be able to stand on its own. And so I think we should trust that as we proclaim messages of inclusion in the church, in different cultures and different places around the world, that hearts and minds will change. But for those of us on the LGBT inclusion side, I also think that we have to be gracious as we promote this message of inclusion, to realize that change takes a long time. And yes, there are lives on the line. There are places where it is very dangerous to be a LGBT person because of Christian governments and churches and things like that. And we should stand against that and recognize that it's taken hundreds of years for the United States to get anywhere near LGBT inclusion. It's going to take some time for societies and for the church to transform, and we should allow and empower, I would say, people from those cultures to speak up on their own behalf. One of my biggest convictions is that we are not to be a voice for the voiceless, but we are to give the voiceless back their voice. Our job should be uplifting the voices that aren't being heard in other cultures, not stepping into other cultures and telling them from our perspective what is right or what they should do.
Well put. Thank you so much. Back to you, Ryan.
Brandon, that's some parting words. I'm wondering what you might say to the young LGBTQ person who is maybe sitting where you were 20 years ago
Mm.
and perhaps feels stuck. Is there a message that you have for them?
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, I'm going to sound like a broken record. The thing I say every day to everyone that I'm talking about in these kind of situations is your fear is real, but your fear is not coming from God. So if you are finding yourself on this precipice of trying to figure out how do I align who I feel God has made me to be with church teaching, with my family, with whatever, um, and you're terrified, it's understandable. But remember that if you're moving in a direction of God and of truth, you should be moving towards love and freedom and openness, not more fear. And so I would say, be on the lookout for those that are causing you to be afraid and the kind of messages that are causing you to be afraid, and identify those as not being from God, because God should cast out that fear. The other side of it is take your time. A lot of folks feel like there is a rush to figure out all the answers, to come out of the closet or not, or whatever. And I think our lives are all unfolding, beautiful journeys. Our stories are all unique. And I think just because LGBT acceptance has exploded on the cultural scene, it can be really difficult for young LGBT people who are struggling with their faith and sexuality to feel like, well, it's everywhere, so I should be able to just rush out of the closet. And I think oftentimes that could do a lot more harm than good, because it takes time to process. It takes time to understand yourself, to understand your faith, to understand who you want to be in the world. And so there's no rush in this journey. Step by step, go along, find people in your life that can speak truth to you, that can support you wherever you end up on your journey. And when the time is right, you'll know the direction you should go in. You'll know who you're being called to be in the world. And slow down.
Reverend Brandan Robertson, I want to thank you on behalf of Outreach for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for the work that you all do in the world.